So in this week's Parsha, we find, it's a double Parsha actually, Matot, Masai, but we're going to focus on Matot this evening. And in the beginning of Parashat Matot, we find instructions for both men and women around the making and keeping of vows. And the instructions for men are very brief and simple. If a man has voiced a pledge, he's obligated to fulfill it. That's it. There's no restrictions on what kind of vow a man can make. But for women, it seems to be more complicated. There are significant constraints, and both age and marital status, play a role in determining a woman's right to fulfill any promises that she wishes to make. Rabbi Elizabeth Goldstein explains that the instructions for women shed an important light on the status of women within the family in biblical times, and they illustrate the circumstances under which the male head of household can overrule decisions made by the women within his household. At the same time, she writes, these detailed laws indicate that women could make independent vows to God or to other people, under normal circumstances, would be held accountable to fulfill them. Before we go too much more into that, we might want to clarify what a biblical vow actually is and what it actually entails. So according to Rabbi Goldstein, whose commentary is part of this Torah, a women's commentary, the people in biblical times typically made vows in times of great distress, maybe if they were ill or infertile, so not so different from today. And a vow could be made in private. It didn't need to be witnessed by a priest or an official functionary of any kind, but a vow did need to be spoken aloud in order for it to be binding. And our Parsha lays out that unlike the vows of a man, the vows of a woman are subject to the approval of her father or her husband, if she's not yet married, or else her husband. And if the father or the husband approve of the vow when they learn of it, then the woman is obligated to fulfill the vow. But if the father or the husband does not approve of the vow, the woman is restrained from fulfilling her promise. The language of the Torah is that she's restrained from fulfilling her promise. And she's not held accountable for breaking it. So the male head of the household either has to permit or annul the vow immediately within the first day upon hearing of it. And after that, they can't change their mind. So it's a one-time opportunity for the head of the household to stop the vow or else let it proceed. And Rabbi Goldstein comments that although we don't know how common it was for women to make vows or what they typically entailed, the laws in this parsha tell us at the very least that women were making vows and that the situations in which they were making vows required some kind of legal attention. And while our parsha doesn't tell us the specific kinds of vows that women might have made, there are other places in the Torah where we read about women who make vows. So on Yom Kippur, we read about Hannah, a barren woman who dedicates her future son to God's service, should God answer her prayers for a child. Earlier in the book of Numbers, we read that women, like men, can dedicate themselves to become Nazirites. And in the book of Proverbs, there's a mention of a woman who fulfills a vow by making a payment. Regarding the laws in this parsha, Rabbi Goldstein explains that the chief concern seems to be around relegating the impact that a woman's vow could have upon the household, which is represented by the male head of household, her father or her husband. In other words, The laws are responding to perhaps a reasonable concern on the part of the male head of household that the women in his household might make a vow that could lead to a loss of household property, his household property. For unmarried women especially, who didn't own property of their own, anything offered as part of her pledge would actually have belonged to her father. To some extent, even a measure of control over her sexuality and sexual behavior. Some of the vows that men and women in the Torah make are called isarim, which are vows of abstention. And biblical women might have undertaken a variety of oaths of self-denial. So according to Rabbi Devorah Weisberg, the rabbis of the Talmud wrote about women who made vows denying themselves certain foods, bathing, the use of cosmetics and jewelry, and sexual intercourse, perhaps because these were things over which women had some measure of control, and things also that gave them pleasure. In all of these areas, Rabbi Goldstein teaches us that women who undertake an oath and forego certain things also have an impact on the household in general and the authority of men in particular. So whether the woman was pledging some kind of property or whether the vow was a vow of abstention, either way it could impact the household, and thus the head of the household would have a say in whether or not the woman could keep her vow. Excuse me. So because the rabbis were clearly concerned that women's abilities to make vows could harm the household or the marriage, the Mishnah allows for a man to divorce his wife due to her vows. And the Talmud even goes so far as to suggest that a man might simply not want to marry a woman who's known to make vows. On the other hand, the Talmud also teaches that if a man makes vows that compromise his wife's ability to eat certain foods, or wear jewelry, or visit her family, or attend social functions, or a man who upholds his wife's own vows of self-denial for a lengthy period, he should rather just divorce her, since his actions make her life uncomfortable. So it might seem from all of this like the regulating of women's vows is purely practical, a way for men to protect their property from being lost through the vows made by the women in their household, or a way for them to keep peaceful relations in the household. And yet, Rabbi Jacqueline Koch-Ellenson teaches us that the vows that we make are much more than simple pledges. When we make vows, she writes, we put into speech our deepest fears and most profound hopes. Many of us make various commitments to do certain things or give up certain things that we cherish in order to avert danger or bring about a hoped for future. But for the biblical woman, although she possesses the ability to make a vow, she might have to abandon it if the male authority figure in her life hears of it. Given that fact, Rabbi Koch-Ellenson asks, what are her options? She can take her chances with a vow and being heard, or to avoid her vow being annulled, she might opt to make her vow, but without anyone hearing her, since only vows that are spoken aloud are binding. However, Rabbi Koch-Ellenson reminds us that remarks that by making her vow in silence, the biblical woman would therefore be forced to follow and be complicit in maintaining the culture's attitude towards her desire for personal expression. She herself thus participates in her own silencing. This Shabbat marks the beginning of Women's Month, a time where we celebrate the achievements of women and the progress of societies where women have attained equal rights, at least legally or in theory. And yet, Rabbi Koch-Ellenson reminds us that while we think we are free from the constraints imposed upon biblical women, this is often not quite true. She refers to mothers who have often had to relinquish certain freedoms in order to care for their children, to female professionals who may choose careers that don't sufficiently reflect their capabilities in order to be available to support a spouse or a partner or a parent. We might not explicitly associate such situations with vow making or breaking, she writes, but in certain important ways, the relationship to vows exists. Like vow making in the Torah, women's aspirations, spoken or not, are promises that we make even if only to ourselves. And when we give them up because of external pressures, we pay a price. On the one hand, she writes, we live in a time when, as women, we're blessedly free from the kinds of controls that the Book of Numbers prescribes, although I would caution us not to forget that there are women still in places like Iran and Afghanistan who are not free from these kinds of restrictions and who are subject to restrictions far worse. On the other hand, she continues, we find ourselves within a web of relationships where we often have to give up what we had promised ourselves or redirect our abilities. The stereotype of the Jewish mother may represent in some ways an effort to take power through the very vehicles that entrap her by making a nice home, cooking gourmet meals, and having successful children. Women want to fulfill our responsibilities. We want to live up to our expectations as spouses, mothers, daughters, but we also want to be heard, to play an active role in our communities, to see ourselves and be seen as powerful. We are aware that our culture could not survive if we sometimes did not voluntarily place our own needs as secondary. And yet, we are not always aware of the price that some of us pay for that choice. This month, let us take time to really see the women in our lives and in our communities for both their achievements and their sacrifices. Let us hold in our hearts the women who still live in the dark of fundamental societies that oppress them, are violent toward them, and restrain them from fulfilling their deepest hopes and aspirations. There are Jewish women, Muslim women, African women, women all over the world who live shackled, literally or metaphorically, by the men who rule over them. Let us not forget them. Let us use our hard-won rights and privileges to be their voice and to fight for their freedoms. And let us not forget to affirm and uplift the women around us so that their sacrifices are easier to bear and so that their successes are acknowledged and celebrated with gratitude. If we're going to make vows, let these be the vows we make today. Amy Hirtha.